Good afternoon. I'm Charles Shapiro, President of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Today's program is with former U.S. Senator Sam Nunn and his biographer, Dr. Frank Leith Jones. I want to give a special welcome to some of our board members, Asma Fareed, Gordon Giffen, Eric Joyner, and Jim Reed, and to a huge number of people from Georgia Tech at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs who've joined us today. Today's program is sponsored by the Coca-Cola Company. Rocky Reef is the Senior Director for Economic and Fiscal Policy at the Coca-Cola Company and a member of our board of directors. Rocky, who is Senator Sam Nunn's legislative director, is going to introduce him. Thanks, Rocky. Over to you.
Thank you, Charles. And on behalf of Coca-Cola, we really appreciate the opportunity to support today's program. And I just want to say it's an honor to introduce Dr. Jones, the author of Sam Nunn, Statesman of the Nuclear Age. Frank's currently the George C. Marshall Chair of Military Studies at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle. And prior to beginning this chapter of his career about 15 years ago, Frank had a long career in the Army and also as a civil servant for the Department of the Army. And Frank, on a personal note, I just have to tell you, I really enjoyed reading the book, and it was really a trip down memory lane for me. Starting when you acknowledged like Kathy Gwynn and Jim Locker and Arnold Panaro at the start. And then I thought it was very fitting at the end when you referenced Senator Nunn's speech at the Georgia State Capitol, where he clarified that he was retiring from the Senate, but he was not retiring from public engagement and public service. And as all of us that know Senator Nunn, he's true to his word. And as you can see, he's still far from retired today. And just want to say that, particularly as a former staffer, it's really a privilege to introduce Senator Nunn to the council today. And I know the audience here, he really doesn't need an introduction to, and given the time limit that Charles has given me on this introduction, I know there's not enough time to fit it all in. But really on a personal note, I just want to say thank you to Senator Nunn. I can remember many years ago that you took a chance on hiring me really early in my career, and I know I caused a few bumps for you along the way, most of them inadvertently, but you were always really supportive of me, and you provided me an opportunity to grow and learn. And I think probably the best thing you could do is you allowed Julie and I to meet while we were working for you. But a few things, Senator, when people ask me what it was like to work for you, I just think back and no matter what the issue, you were always prepared. And I was always amazed at how good a questioner you were, which I think is an art, but you were always a better listener on what people were saying to you. And then as people were talking or answering questions, you always had the ability to connect the dots and recognize the good ideas. And once you did that, you were able to paint a picture, and thereby a strategy came forth. And I think that's a great skill to take. The issues that you were dealing with were often very, very complex, and yet you were able to make them simple. And then lastly, which I think is even a better thing, you always focused on results and not taking the credit for them. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for all the work that you've done for the state and for the country, and what you continue to do. So Charles, with that, I'll turn this back over to you, and I'm looking forward for the conversation today.
Thanks so much. That's a great intro, Rocky, and I appreciate that very much. So let me start off. Frank Jones, let me ask you first. What made you want to write a book about Senator Sam Nunn, and why is now the time to write that book?
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I want to thank you and certainly the World Affairs Council, Coca-Cola, and Senator Nunn for allowing me to be with you this afternoon, because this is really a pleasure and a privilege. Let me just say also that my remarks today are solely my own and not a reflection of U.S. government policy or defense policy or the Army's policy. So just get that out of the way. As Rocky mentioned, I had spent more than 30 years working as a military officer and as a civil servant. And I got very familiar with Senator Nunn's career and was familiar with his leadership, particularly his chairmanship of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So I think that was an important element of why I was interested in doing this. And he had 8 years as a chair. So I thought that was a period which really one could study how the impact that a committee chair can have on US policy, in this case, national security policy and strategy, but also generally beyond the parameters of the institution. And so that was one interest. The second is, I think over the last several decades, there's been this impression by scholars, to some degree, journalists, and the American public, that national security issues, foreign policy issues, are the purview of the president. And that's not what the Constitution indicates. And I thought it was time for a corrective to that. And looking at Senator Nunn's career as a way to study the role of the Senate in particular, but also Congress more generally. And lastly, why now? We live in a time of partisanship and of polarization. And there are moments when that collaboration can occur. And I wanted to have that reflection as well, that there are times when the national interest really supersedes anything else. And I thought Senator Nunn's career was a great example of an individual having that influence and also being very concerned about the national interest.
That's great. Senator Nunn, can you tell us what is the NTI project that you're devoting your time to?
Well, we're tackling a lot of things in terms of trying to reduce nuclear risk and biological risk. And we have been since 2001, when Ted Turner took the lead in putting up the funding, and Ted continues to be a huge part of NTI. And Warren Buffett has been a huge part of NTI in terms of providing support and funding. A lot of other people have helped. But if you boil it down, one of the top priorities is to keep nuclear material safe and secure, and to get rid of them whenever you can, particularly weapons usable nuclear material, but also radiological material that can be made a dirty bomb, because preventing catastrophic terrorism is a huge challenge. And the know-how of making a crude nuclear weapon is out there and has been for a number of years, something that back in the early days of the nuclear weapons, people did not think would happen, but it has happened. So the know-how is out there, and keeping materials, weapons usable materials out of the hands of the bad guys is enormously important. We also try to avoid proliferation of other countries getting nuclear weapons, and we try to keep our eye also on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which basically was a bargain between countries that had nuclear weapons, who pledged way back in the late 60s, including the United States, to get rid of those weapons step by step. And the bargain was countries without nuclear weapons would not develop them. It hadn't been perfect, but it has been the kind of the glue that kept us from having 20, 30 countries with nuclear weapons, which would make the world a lot more unstable than it is now. There are 9 countries that have them, and that's far too many. But the eventual goal of a world without nuclear weapons is an enormously important aspiration, even though it will take a lot of steps, a lot of verification, and a lot of cooperation to get there. We also are involved in the biological side. I won't go into detail on that, but suffice it to say that the pandemic, I think, has demonstrated what Mother Nature can do, but also in our technological advanced stage now. It's not just Mother Nature, unfortunately, but bad guys can also use biological pathogens to cause tremendous amount of havoc in the world. So reducing those risks, nuclear as well as biological, is what our mission has been all about. We have an international board. People from Russia, China are on the board, Europe, United States. So this is a worldwide challenge and a worldwide undertaking.
As you say, this is maybe the most important issue. Certainly it's an existential issue for all of us,
Yeah.
but it receives so little attention. You know, if you were to do an analysis of whether it's Google searches or column inches in the New York Times, climate change, a whole bunch of issues get so much more attention than nuclear threat and biological threat. You must be frustrated.
Well, of course, Bill Gates in the last several years, and distinguished epidemiologists for the last 15, 20 years have told us that a pandemic was coming. This was not a secret. But people don't like to think about these things until it actually happens. But things that we never dream will happen, have happened. And that's the way we feel about nuclear. It's not on people's minds until something really bad happens. And the challenge of leadership is to get out in front of catastrophes, prevent them from happening, but you don't get a whole lot of attention on what you prevent. And that's the nature of what we're involved in, is prevention, risk reduction. And that's enormously important. You're not going to eliminate all risk in the biological or the nuclear arena. But if you can reduce that risk, you make the odds of some catastrophe happening far less likely.
Frank, let me go back to you. You teach at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Is the Army, are your students, is the Defense Department in general paying enough attention to the threat of nuclear war?
I definitely think so. Part of that is because of the strategic environment that we're in currently, because as only 2 years ago, the nuclear posture review was conducted by then Secretary Mattis and the Secretary of Energy. So those are indicators, I think, of the ongoing realization of how, as Senator Nunn said, the strategic landscape has changed and that we are actually in a second nuclear age, the first one ending that period of time when the Soviet Union dissolved, and therefore there was this perhaps inattention to nuclear weaponry and that issue in general. And as the Senator mentioned, the pandemic and the 9/11 events and terrorism remind us of this. Nuclear terrorism is certainly involved in this as well. But I also think if you look at the new interim strategic guidance that the Biden administration put out this month, nuclear weapons and those type of issues, deterrence and North Korean and Iranian programs, they're all mentioned in that document. So there is attention being paid to it. As far as officers and the War College are concerned, we're definitely involved in looking at this. Certainly sometimes, as Senator Nunn just mentioned, events drive it, get people's attention. You may remember several years ago now, the Air Force had a problem where some nuclear weapons were flown from one area to another. And so that became a strategic area of emphasis, special area of emphasis by the chairman. But over the years, we've added, our curriculum includes the Cuban Missile Crisis. We talk about deterrence theory and escalation and that relationship between conventional and nuclear weapons. We have case studies on North Korea and the negotiations during the Clinton and Bush administrations. And we're talking about the role today of functional commands and such as strategic command, which has a responsibility in this area, as well as the combatant commands of each region. Because as Senator Nunn mentioned, there are nuclear states that we have either a relationship with or that we have some concerns about their competitive aspects. So yeah, we're paying quite a lot of attention to it.
How does Senator Nunn's career help us, help your students, help the current structure of the Defense Department understand nuclear war in the contemporary security environment?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that really come to fore. Some of the issues that we're grappling with today and have been grappling since the end of the Cold War, they're present in the work that those same issues were something that Senator Nunn himself was concerned about and continues to be concerned about, obviously, with the nuclear threat initiative that he started with the other two gentlemen he mentioned. So that aspect is very important. And then we see ourselves, and I think this is perhaps maybe really valid point. What is happening to the erosion of arms control treaties? We've withdrawn from some treaties. What are the implications for that? If we withdraw for something, so the so-called Iranian agreement, what does that mean in terms of military strategy? So there's a relevance there. And those were the types of issues that he was working on all through his career from the 1970s into the 1990s. So I think there's a lot to be said for about understanding the historical aspects of this and how that impinges upon the current, because those same actors, they may have a different name other than the Soviet Union, but some of the same concerns are still there in a time of so-called great power competition.
Senator Nunn, at last December, you wrote an opinion piece in which you called for guardrails on the President of the United States' ability to deploy and use nuclear weapons. Why can't we trust the President of the United States to make the decision to launch or not launch? That's been our policy since the Truman administration, and it seems like it's worked so far.
Well, everything works until it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, you have, in the case of nuclear, Armageddon. So you got to reduce the risk in every way. I think our founding fathers answered that question when they decided that Congress should have the right to declare war. They didn't want one person declaring war. Now that has eroded because of time pressures in the nuclear age. I don't think you're going to see time in the future, or nor have you in the past since nuclear weapons were developed, for there to be committee meetings and full-scale congressional debate if we are under attack. But where I think we should have a lot more guardrails is the first use of nuclear weapons by the United States. And that's the focus, is getting Congress to play a more meaningful role. One of the unique things about Frank Jones is that he really has taken a deep dive and thoroughly understands the role that Congress plays, for better or worse, in terms of national security. And you start with the Constitution, because the Constitution made Congress responsible for raising armies and for maintaining a navy and for funding and calling up a militia. That's the congressional responsibility on the Constitution. We've gotten away from that. And the War Powers Act has never worked. It needs it's another whole subject, but it needs, I think, a total relook. And I think Congress right now should form a liaison committee, similar to what we have with the Arms Control Observer Group. And that liaison committee, in my view, should focus on Russia policy, or the lack thereof, on nuclear weapons and the risks there that are there on nuclear weapons, and also NATO, because NATO is the heart of our alliance and our security. If you had that kind of liaison group to keep informed with the State Department, Defense Department, and the White House, you would have Congress participating much more in these decisions. But right now, we've had a severe erosion of the role of Congress. And that's one of the things I'm so gratified to Frank for doing, and that is pointing out not only the congressional authority, but a congressional responsibility in this arena, not at the expense of the president, but most presidents would welcome, as Ronald Reagan did and George Shultz did as Secretary of State, having Congress much better informed and more involved in the war, in the treaty making process. For instance, the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which unfortunately has been canceled now, but it got rid of a whole class of nuclear weapons in Europe by both the Soviet Union and the United States, that compressed decision time and made mistakes more likely because you had no time. They were deployed so close to their targets. So right now, one of the things that I think is a top priority is increasing decision time for both the President of the United States and for the President of Russia, and eventually also China and the other nuclear powers, because in moments of great stress and tension, particularly with cyber possible interference with command and control and warning systems, war by blunder or mistake is I think much more likely than it has been in the past because of technology and a lot of other things. So increasing the amount of time a president would have to make a decision whether to pull the trigger on our nuclear arsenal under what might be false warning, I think it's enormously important. And when you scratch your head and think about it, we have a survival stake in having the Russian president with more decision time also, because if he gets a false warning and decides that he's either got to use his nuclear weapons or lose them, then we're the target. And the same thing will be, I think, true with China in the future. And the same thing exists with India and Pakistan, which is one of the most dangerous spots in the world. So I'll stop right there, but suffice it to say that I think one person should not make decisions that in the first use of nuclear weapons, which could basically destroy civilization as we know it, no matter who that person is.
Right. We had a program, must be 6 months ago now, with former Secretary of Defense William Perry. And he suggested that the United States should just flat out renounce first strike ability with nuclear weapons, that the United States should just tell the world, we're never going to strike first. Does that make sense? Do you agree?
I think that is the aspiration, that is the direction but I think you have to work that very carefully with your allies. The Japanese, for instance, have refrained from building a nuclear arsenal, relying on America. And of course, they worry about conventional war. And they very much count on the United States in terms of conventional and implicitly nuclear. And the same thing is true with our European allies. So yes, that's the direction that I would move in, but it has to be done step by step and very carefully with our allies.
He also suggested doing away with all U.S. land-based missiles.
Call from
Pardon me.
121.
Of course, I'm getting a call.
531-8722.
Sorry. Does that make sense? That we should simply do away with land-based missiles?
Well, I think you have to be very careful about.
Hello, this is USAA calling regarding.
I think you have to be very careful about any part of the triad, but land-based missiles are vulnerable. They're in fixed silos. We've debated a lot about different basing modes. I think the most important part of our deterrent are the submarines that can survive. And that prevents us from making a mistake because we don't have to fire those weapons the first time someone comes in and says, we think there is an attack going on against the United States. We can wait because we have survivable weapons. The same thing is true when you mobilize the bombers. You can put them up in the air and they can survive. But land-based fixed silo missiles, they're sitting there, they're sitting ducks. Basically, the Russians have them, we have them. I would like to see both countries get rid of vulnerable land-based missiles that have to be used or lost at early stages. That makes a blunder much more likely. But I do think it has to be done in concert with the overall view of arms control and within that context. But I think modernizing the land-based missiles, if I have to choose as to what the priorities are, it would be submarines first, bombers and standoff weapons second, and land-based fixed silo missiles would be the bottom priority for me in terms of spending huge amounts of money on modernization.
The huge amounts of money is very important as well. I mean, this is very, very expensive. You mentioned China and Pakistan and India. You mentioned Iran, North Korea. Where do you see the greatest threat to the United States or frankly to the world from nuclear weapons?
Well, I think Pakistan and India has to be listed as a spot that is very dangerous. They are in close geographic proximity to each other. They have very, very short warning times because of that. They've had several wars and they have a lot of fundamental extremism where people could actually want to start a war between those two countries. Not many, fortunately, but I think that's a dangerous spot. The Iranians, if they develop nuclear weapons, they have not yet. If they do, it's going to set off a series of other countries that want nuclear weapons. So that's a very dangerous spot. And of course, North Korea. The North Koreans already have nuclear weapons, and getting rid of those nuclear weapons under some type of arrangement is enormously important. So all of those are important. But when you really look at the two countries that can destroy the world, it's the United States and Russia. The United States and Russia have 90% of the nuclear weapons, 90% of the nuclear materials. We now have military forces facing each other close proximity, both in Europe and the Middle East. So we have got to get back to strategic dialogue with the Russians. We disagree with them on many things. We don't have the same values. We have different interests, but we have certain responsibilities we share with the Russians, and those responsibilities are to prevent nuclear war. We also have responsibilities with China as one of the most important nations in the world. We've got to have strategic dialogue with both those countries. We've got to sit down and talk about these dangers. We have mutual existential dangers that we each face. And the absence of strategic, sustained, and effective dialogue with Russia and China is an enormously, is a big gap right now. And I think we've got to get over this proposition that talking about strategic mutual existential interest is a reward for good behavior.
Right.
And stopping those kind of talks is a punishment for bad behavior. That goes very much against American security interests and the interest of our allies. So I'm hoping the Biden administration will move in that direction, both with Russia and with China, and certainly in close concert with our allies in Europe and in Asia.
I couldn't agree with you more. It seems that's when you have problems, when you have issues, is when you want to talk to your enemies, not when you want to
Absolutely.
shoulder to them.
If we didn't have risk, I mean, we don't have to have that kind of engagement with the United Kingdom, even though they have nuclear weapons, because we have common interests. Is when you don't have common interests, when you don't have common values, that becomes even more important to have those kind of discussions. And, you know, we don't think about it very much, but we have a mutual stake. We have a national security stake in the Russian warning systems. And they have a stake in our warning systems. We don't think about those things. So it's not just what we can do and our capability, it's also what they can and cannot do, because a failure in their warning systems could lead to real disaster. And that's why it's so important that we develop red lines on some of this new technology, including starting with cyber and also the existential interest we have in understanding artificial intelligence and not making things so automatic that you'd have no human being making these decisions. That is not the direction we want to move in.
Frank, let me ask you, what can we do as ordinary citizens? I mean, you've been teaching this, writing about it. What can ordinary citizens do to help make the world safer from nuclear threat?
I think that Senator Nunn mentioned a few of them. First of all, is becoming educated about the issues. And that means reading the national strategies. That means reading, if you're interested in international affairs, nuclear posture review, becoming educated, finding out where your members of Congress actually stand on these issues. And it also, I think it's important to recognize, and Senator Nunn mentioned this, that this is not just a diplomatic function. Treaties and arms control are just not about diplomats. And that's why not only is it, we talk about treaties, we're talking about the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but we're also talking about the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee, because this has ramifications far beyond just merely the signature on a document or a resolution of advice and consent, as the Constitution calls for. So I think those are important elements of it. And I think there's another element that really is important, and that is, do we understand these other nations? Do we have strategic empathy? Do we understand their, not just their nuclear doctrine or their policies or their capabilities? What's their belief system? What are their assumptions they're making about how the world works? What is their culture? What is their political culture? What is their decision-making process? And you get that transparency, if you will, by, as you've been both talking about, entering into that dialogue. So I think that dialogue is very important. And that dialogue is not just among government officials, but non-governmental organizations and people acting as, if you will, ambassadors for their own nation to bring these topics up. So I think that's part of the education process as well.
That's great.
Ambassador, let me just underscore what
Please.
Frank just said about people to people. I think civil society has to engage. Now, we don't have exact counterparts. It's not apples to apples in Russia or China, but we have to have a lot more dialogue between civil society in our country and Russia, as well as China. The future of the world is going to depend on it. The question of whether our children and grandchildren are basically under the threat of terrible catastrophe with very huge risk on both biological and on nuclear, as well as climate change. It depends on societies getting to know each other. It'll be a long process, but it has to, I think, be put in high gear. It is not just governments. It's much broader than that.
I mean, we're going to go to questions from the audience. And if you haven't sent your question in, please do use the question and answer function. Please make your question short so that I can understand it. I appreciate that. Edward Chartar asks, is the Iran nuclear deal a good or bad deal? Should the U.S. re-enter the agreement?
Well, we got several of those agreements. One of the most important disappeared a number of years ago was the Conventional Forces Agreement. Countries develop nuclear weapons because they feel insecure, and they basically feel insecure many times because of conventional disparities. So that one got tossed in the trash can long ago. It needed updating. It certainly was not completely updated, but it should not have been, I think, eliminated. You also have the INF agreement, which I already alluded to, intermediate nuclear forces, medium range missiles in Europe. That one has now been terminated by the United States and by Russia. We got to have something to replace it. If we start putting those missiles back in Europe, it's going to make security more difficult for both Russia and for our NATO allies and for the United States. We also had an Open Skies treaty that let there be certain inspection flights fly over both Russia as well as European countries, as well as the United States. And that one has now been tossed in the trash can. That was Eisenhower's proposition, and it was put in place by Bush, terminated by President Trump, which I think was a mistake. So we have all those agreements that are now terminated. Fortunately, President Biden and President Putin have agreed on extending the New START agreement, which has all the verification provisions in it and the notice provisions, which is enormously important. So at least we have that treaty remaining. But all of these treaties build confidence. All of these treaties in and of themselves are important, but they also, and Frank mentioned this, they have our military and our civilian leaders talking to each other over a period of time. So we get to understand each other. We get to understanding what the other country's fears are. Their fears may not be something that we agree with, but if they are real, then they make a difference in their behavior. And so we have to take them into account. So this kind of dialogue on arms control is sometimes almost as important as the agreement itself. And we have to do that in cyber now. We have to do it in artificial intelligence. We have to do that with Russia and China and protecting nuclear material. We have to have a number of countries involved in the overall effort to basically prevent dirty bombs from being used, because radiological material is all over the globe, and dirty bombs is not a would not be a nuclear detonation, but they would do huge economic damage with radiation. So all of these things have got to be on the front burner, and right now they're on the back burner.
Jim Reed. I'm sorry,
Charles, if I could just add something to that.
Sure.
And I'm not going to talk about the Iran deal specifically, but I think it's important to recognize that arms controls agreements are not one-time deals, if you will. They require nurturing, they require continual dialogue, and they also require a realization that not any one of them is perfect. There's no magic wand. And so as Senator Nunn was listing those agreements, we have to think about the evolution of arms control between the Soviet Union, United States, and others, that is an ongoing process. And so you can't assume that one agreement, which requires verification, can be just taken at face value and left as it is. And so I just want to make that general comment about arms control agreements and overall.
That's important. Of course, that doesn't play well in the current political environment. Or
Yes, right now.
environment of 20 years ago.
It doesn't play well. One of the things that Ernie Moniz and I, who's the CEO of NTI, are pushing is a fail-safe review, starting with the United States, but all nuclear countries, taking a look at how technology has changed the risk and doing everything we can internally, not agreement, not a treaty, to mitigate that kind of risk, particularly with cyber, and encouraging other countries to do the same thing, because out of those kind of reviews, if we could get them going, would come the realization that we've got to have some understandings in these arenas. We did that one time when Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense and I was chairman of the committee. I went over and talked to him and said, look, somebody's got to take a look at attribution and whether if a country with submarines pulled off the shore of the United States and shot a nuclear weapon at us, we would immediately respond by attacking the Soviet Union, even if it wasn't them. And the same question in reverse. Can we have real-time attribution? Well, that question is really relevant now with cyber. And it's time for another internal review. Cheney actually undertook that kind of review. It became known as the Kirkpatrick Commission. It was not agreement, not a treaty, it was internal. But all countries need to do that. And if I had my way, rather than an arms control treaty right now, I would have the president of Russia and the president of the United States basically get together and say to their militaries, look, if we've got 6 minutes warning time now, go out and give us some options of how we get to 10, and then 20 minutes, and then 30 minutes, and then a half hour, and then an hour. So we have more time for decisions, less chance of blunder. It would be complex, it'd be complicated. It probably wouldn't lend itself to a treaty, but it could be enormously important in the world we live in today. That would probably be more important than a treaty at the moment, because it would alert both leaders and the leadership of the country to the fact that we do have mutual stakes in the survival of our countries, of our people, and indeed of the world.
I've got a question here that ties right into that, and this is from Jim Reed. He asks, how real is the risk of deep fakes in generating the conditions of adversarial leaders making threats to trigger response from the other? And in particularly with cyber issues and penetration, how serious is that, and how well prepared are we to confront that, Senator?
Frank, let me defer to you on that one.
No, I think it's a very serious issue. And as the senator just mentioned, part of this is recognizing not only your own country's vulnerabilities and the risk taking that he mentioned earlier, and how much are people understanding values and behaviors of others, and understanding how they might react in a situation, or are they making threats? I mean, some of this is psychological, as you know. Deterrence theory rests on credibility and capability. And so deterring someone from taking an action and the punishment that may ensue is part of this calculus, if you will. But I think it's interesting that Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks last month, in a memo that she sent out, and I've not seen the memorandum, but has been reported, one of the key areas that she's asking to be looked at as part of the fiscal year 2022 budget is the whole nuclear command, control, and communication network. And that seems somewhat simplistic by saying the word network, but we're talking about space assets, cyber assets, warnings, systems, presidential orders, everything down to actually directing of forces. So it's a huge enterprise. And so when you consider that that's a system, how are systems structured and where are the vulnerabilities in a system? And we know that those exist because systems are complex and they adapt to situations. And so obviously, as Senator Nunn has said, not only are we concerned about cyber attacks and maybe distortions there, but space and the militarization of space and satellites have an impact on this as well. And as I said, the other aspects is just the nodes that are in this network that have to be understood and where they can be disrupted or destroyed.
That's good. Wow. So here's a question from Jack Siegel, who is a former arms control negotiator and is sending this from Traverse City, Michigan. He says the Biden Pentagon is pursuing hypersonic missiles and other weapons that violate the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. Is there a way to stop this?
Well, I don't think I could comment on whether they violate a treaty. The treaty, because the treaty's gone, is basically not in existence anymore. But to the point, the underlying point, which is a good one, we've got to find a way to avoid going back to deployment of medium-range missiles by Russia and by the United States in Europe. For one thing, the United States allies are very reluctant to have those missiles introduced on their soil. So even if we develop such intermediate missiles for other areas of the world, it's going to be very hard to deploy them in Europe. So I think it's very much I think it was in our interest to continue the INF treaty, although there had to be some understandings on violations that we felt were real violations by the Russians. But I thought that it was an overreaction to throw the whole treaty out, and we're going to have some understandings to replace it.
Dorothy Beasley, who's one of our long-term members and great friend, asked what can individuals, what can people like her do besides reading Frank's book? What can they do to become more educated on these issues? I mean, where do they subscribe? Where do they look? Is it in the New York Times? It certainly isn't in our local newspapers around the country. I mean, how do we stay on top of these issues?
I'm going to defer to Frank on that one again. I think he will have a good.
Well, there's some trepidation here. Certainly, forums like this are certainly part of the issue, and I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that I'm showing favoritism. But if you go to the Nuclear Threat Initiative website or other websites that are similar to that, there are ways to do this. And
that's nti.com. Am I correct?
Right. .org, I
Yes.
think.
.org. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And so there's that. And then there's something called Great Decisions Program, which is a program that on foreign policy. So there are mechanisms, and part of it may be since the person who asked the question is a member of the World Affairs Council, it is partially through councils like the World Affairs Councils all over the United States, affiliations that bring these type of issues to the fore. And certainly, again, I have to be cautious about what I'm recommending here, but I often tell my students, it's a matter of reading some of the more focused readings of foreign affairs. Senator Nunn's article back in October of last year was in foreign affairs, foreign policy, et cetera. So again, I'm somewhat hesitant to be specific, but on the other hand, those are the type of recommendations I make to my own students.
I would say probably, I know Dorothy Beasley, and she's probably as well informed as anybody I know. So she's already availing herself of a lot of sources of information. But Bill Perry is just former Secretary of Defense. Bill Perry, who was one of the finest defense secretaries we've ever had. He's just written a book. So the Bill Perry book would be a good place to go. He also has got a series of, I suppose you call them iPods or short videos that he uses, and they are used for classes and courses around the country. And they're excellent. He's got a lot of interviews on there. So that's a very good source of information. We've started, NTI is helping support a program at Georgia Tech at the Nunns School, where they're basically looking at the whole question of deterrence and looking at modern technologies and determining whether, in light of the new technologies, we need to rethink some of our theories of deterrence. Now, that's, to me, getting to the heart of sort of the long run, getting students and professors in our country to think through these things so that it's not just a bunch of generals and admirals and senators sitting around a table, it really gets out there of the public, because it is a matter of survival of our country and countries around the world. So that kind of course, in my view, is very important. We're just starting on it. But I would hope it would spread in the United States to other schools and other campuses. Then I hope we would have, with modern technology, some joint courses with our Russian colleagues of college age, all unclassified. And then eventually, certainly we want the Europeans involved and the Chinese. So with the information age, we've got to start making technology work for us instead of making the world more risky. And we can do that with the information age if we begin to sort out a common set of facts. The erosion of facts and the erosion of truth and the erosion of analytical and data thinking in the public policy arena is one of our most serious challenges now as a society. You take baseball and football, they're doing all the analysis, they're doing data analysis, they're basing their decisions and businesses are on acquisitions, on data and facts. Public policy arena, we're heading in the opposite direction. And so we've got to correct that. And it starts with the American people and the voters. If voters start asking questions in this arena, believe me, the people running for office will start paying a lot more attention.
We're coming to the end of our time, but let me ask each of you one more question, and before we go, and that is a piece of advice for the Biden administration. Senator Nunn, I hope they're asking you for your views. What can you share with us? What's a piece of advice? If you had one thing you could tell them to do, what would that be?
Well, I think I'd start with what I mentioned in terms of decision time, focusing on decision time, talking to the Russian president about decision time, strategic dialogue, sustained dialogue with both Russia and China on these issues, and also the fail-safe review, which I think is terrific if they start that in the Pentagon and then challenge other nuclear powers to do the same thing. And then I would also offer, this is not just one thing, but I would say Reagan and Gorbachev had it pretty much correct when they said a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must not be fought. That's a pretty good starting point with the US and Russia to reassert that and to get China and other nuclear powers to join in that kind of recognition.
Frank, you got a piece of advice?
Yeah, I just think it goes back to something that Senator Nunn said, and it's something I've written on other than in the book, and that is the engagement with Congress. I think it's time to get the House and Senate leaders, as well as the relevant committee chairs and subcommittee chairs, involved in a dialogue. And that Senator Nunn's career represents that, is an indicator of the value of that. And as Senator Nunn said, and I know that from writing the book, the discussions between even members of the Congress and foreign leaders are important. He met with General Secretary Gorbachev. These are types of events that can take place and should take place, in my view. And the other thing is the value of allies. And NATO is certainly one of those multilateral institutions, I think, that could be used much more effectively to begin that dialogue.
I mean, this has been a great program. I want to thank you, Senator Sam Nunn and Dr. Frank Jones I think we've got more information, more good suggestions, more new ideas to grapple with out of the past 50 minutes than we have in an awfully long time. This has just been great. I want to thank the Coca-Cola Company for sponsoring today's program. I've got 3 requests for audience members. Number 1 is join the World Affairs Council. Join as an individual member, get your company to join as a corporate member. Number 2, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's free. We'll post this conversation there later this afternoon so that you can look at it, share it with people. And 3, buy Frank Jones' book, Sam Nunn, Statesman of the Nuclear Age. It's available wherever fine books are sold. I've got to do a little advertising here for the World Affairs Council. We've got 4 amazing programs over the next week. Tomorrow, We've got Jack Devine, a legendary former CIA spy master and author of Spy Master's Prism, The Fight Against Russian Aggression. That's at noon on Thursday. We've got Allison Badia Goodman, who's the vice president of the Southern Division of the Anti-Defamation League. She's also a council board member, talking about what we can do about hate crimes. Can't tell you how important this is. That evening, we've got a program for people under 35, how to negotiate up in a virtual world with career coach Ariel Lopez. And then finally, next Tuesday, a week from today, we've got the post-COVID economy with Raphael Bostic, the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. So please register for those programs. Let me thank Valeria McPhail from NTI for helping us set this program up, for Valerie Lopez DeFrank, our producer, and her assistant, Laura Brower, Fernando Lucchini, our executive director. And I want to thank you again, Senator Sam Nunn and Dr. Frank Jones, for really an extraordinary hour. Thank you for devoting your time to us. This has been great.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank Rocky Reef and the Coca-Cola Company for sponsoring this. And thank you, Charles, for your tremendous service to our country, as well as the role you're playing now, so important to Atlanta and the region.
Thank you. Boy, I hope I got that recorded. Thank you so much.
And Frank, thank you. Great to be with you.
Good. Thank you. Everybody y'all have a great afternoon. Valeria, hey, bye-bye, y'all.
Goodbye.